But hi, my name is Kara, and for the last time, I am one of the 2020 to 2021 SEEP graduate co-chairs, joined by Anna. This is the very last Gatty lecture series of spring 2021, and then the Gatty co-chair duties will be passed on to Nikita Sokmuno and Bleak. But I've really enjoyed this semester and this year overall, so I'm happy to join you guys for our very last Gatty of the academic 2020 to 2021 year. To introduce the Gatty lecture series very quick, if this is your first time, it is a weekly lecture series featuring advanced SEEP graduate students, as well as academics, diplomats, researchers, and others who have expertise in Southeast Asia. And normally at the Kane Center. Now, obviously, we are in virtual, but hopefully next year, we're finally going to move back to in-person in the beloved Kane Center. So today I have Vinh, who's going to present on configuring the future in Vietnamese Francophone, but I'm going to introduce the format. It's going to be about a 40-minute lecture followed by a 20-minute Q&A, and we're probably going to have a hard stop at around 2:00 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. So for the format of the Q&A, we prefer if people could raise their hands to ask their questions so we can have a live conversation. But if you absolutely feel uncomfortable, then you may put it in the chat, a question in the chat, and then we can work it out that way. And with that, I'm going to recite Vinh's bio and we can get started. So Vinh Phu Pham is a PhD candidate in the Department of Comparative Literature at Cornell University. He has a research background in late 19th century Latin American and peninsular literature, particularly in the Generación, sorry, don't have a good Spanish accent, del 98. His current research interests include questions of race, trauma, and linguistic difference in diasporic literature from post-colonial Vietnam and the Philippines. Vinh's dissertation, tentatively titled "When Exactly is Post-Colonial Time? A Case for Other Temporalities in Vietnamese Francophone and Phil-Hispanic Literature," engages with some of the pragmatic and theoretical issues related to the production and circulation of these two bodies of work. The central argument is that, firstly, rather than an aesthetic regression or a love of anachronisms, post-colonial writers from these traditions anchor their reactionary politics of the American presence by utilizing their former European languages. Secondly, because of the lasting impact of area studies and institutional categorization, many works from these traditions tend to be overlooked as they do not fit in the mold of certain literary trends, which views these novels as backwards looking and out of touch. Vinh's work highlights how one might think differently about some of these authors and their oeuvres, by tracing out some of their implicit temporal norms of post-colonial criticism, which have been placed upon these works. And with that, I welcome our final Gatty lecture of the semester and of the academic year to Vinh.
Hey, thank you, Kara. So I just want to start by thanking the Southeast Asia program for inviting me and giving me this platform to talk about a topic that's held my interest in the past few years. This is actually the second time I was asked to do a Gatty lecture. The first time I was asked, I was a bit embarrassed since I was just starting the dissertation and I didn't really have anything substantial to say yet. So I'm very happy that this time around I do have a lot more to share. That said, it's still a work in progress. So there are some kinks that I need to work out. So I really look forward to people's questions and comments and just to have a good conversation overall about this project. And lastly, I want to thank Michael, who did the SEEP podcast interview with me in preparation for this talk. It was actually quite helpful in trying to compile my thoughts, as well as Anna and Sarah, who worked behind the scenes to make this talk possible. And I also just want to thank everybody who showed up today. I know it's a tough part of the semester, but we're almost done. This is the last one. Okay, so to begin, I just want to give a little bit of context for what I'm about to talk about and how precisely this fits into the larger context of my dissertation. In a broad sense, I'm very interested in post-colonial literature from European languages, in European languages from Southeast Asia, precisely for the type of questions and issues they bring up about identity and cultural transmission. And particularly from Vietnam and the Philippines, where the writing was rather prolific. More importantly, and more often than not, unless the literature from these former colonies are produced in English, which happens to be the language many writers now choose to produce their works, mostly for market reasons, the literature in older European languages tend to have a bad rap. And literature, these languages are then consequently left ignored. This is certainly the case in Vietnam, and it's very much the case in the Philippines, where people have been more likely to have read Jose Rizal in English than they have in the original Spanish. And there are precedents for this, of course, as European colonialism in the region was incredibly violent, as most of us working in the region know, and it left a bad image of those imperial countries, even though that image is still sometimes romanticized in films and books. So over the long of the 20th century, the politics of decolonization have tended to emphasize local vernaculars when trying to bolster their ethno-nationalism. So rather than these former imperial languages. And in Vietnam, we can see that most strongly with, I want to call it Soviet realism, but it's socialist realism. But even prior to independence, despite the fact that French and Spanish were official languages in these colonies, language instruction was never widely accessible to the general population, so it produced a class division between those who could speak these languages and those who could not. I believe this was much more drastic in the Philippines than it was in Vietnam, but the outcome was more or less similar. Not to mention, as many of you here are aware, after the Second World War, one of the undercurrents of the Pax Americana was precisely a systematic Americanization of the forms of expressions, especially in places like Vietnam and the Philippines, which resulted in a further decline of the literary expression in French and Spanish. So the situation I encounter is this. At a national level, this literature is largely ignored in its country of origins for a very simple reason. Most people no longer speak the language. So the majority of the scholarship on them come from European and North American academia, where it's also fairly understudied. Also, for the very simple reason that it requires several layers of expertise. Area studies doesn't quite cover it. And in terms of language, you sort of have to dabble within a few things in order to make this corpus accessible to you. My conviction as to why this is the case, however, is that it has to do with how we have framed the post-colonial moment. That is in terms of why it's really difficult for us to approach it. Which for many seems to have culminated in the 90s, largely due to multiculturalism that came with globalization, and which coincided with the rising debates on world literature as part of this globalist world. Because of this framing, many took the post-colonial moment as a sort of liberatory moment that comes right after independence, which really works out well for places like India and Pakistan. Yet, because formal independence did not result directly in a clean break from external occupation, as was the case in Vietnam and the Philippines, where the US presence really put into question the nature and timing of coloniality, Vietnamese Francophone and Phil-Hispanic literature don't tend to be thought of when one thinks of post-colonial. Generally, we think of South Asia, right? And much less of Latin America, which is also technically post-colonial. Even though, as a result, not many people are sure what to do with this corpus or where to include it. French departments tend to have a hard time with it. Vietnamese studies don't really emphasize it. And the same goes for Spanish with the Philippines. We're not really sure what to do with it. This is the context that I'm working with. And it is this strange temporality where this literature is still there with very few readers, witnessing its own inevitable decline that I am interested in. Okay, so that's the broader project. So now I can get into today's talk. While Vietnamese Francophone literature makes up only a small portion of French studies in North American academia, in recent years, there seems to have been a surge of interest from scholars as traditional French studies programs look more towards the Francophone world. Building on Jack Jaeger's A Vietnamese Novel in French in 1987, which was responsible for inaugurating the field of Vietnamese Francophone in the United States, works like Natalie Kyo Nguyen's Vietnamese Voices, Gender and Cultural Identity in Vietnamese Francophone, and Carl Ashoka Brito's Disorientation, France, Vietnam, and the Ambivalence of Interculturality, followed by Chinh Salao's Le Roman Vietnamien Francophone, as well as a number of articles and dissertations, all stands as a testament to how this subfield has developed over the years. It is interesting, however, that when Jack Jaeger inaugurated this field, it seemed to have been a thing of the past. So in the conclusion, he writes this. In South Vietnam in the mid-1970s, Francophone culture was no longer a collective phenomenon. The use of French still persisted. However, in certain businesses, though English was much more important commercially. The present state of affairs is far from clear. As for the Vietnamese living in Paris, they will eventually be absorbed into the cultural mainstream, diluting the uniqueness of their culture and background. Already there are people of Vietnamese ancestry who, having been born and raised in France, speak French as the primary language, and very little, if any, Vietnamese. This process appears irreversible and seems destined to put an end to Vietnamese Francophone literature. Surely people carrying Vietnamese names will continue to write in French, but they will no longer bring the same cultural backgrounds to their texts. Whatever the status of the language may be or become, the peak of Vietnamese Francophone literature appears to have passed. So far from being optimistic, what Jaeger's words seem to suggest is that one, the era of Vietnamese Francophone has already passed its apogee and that any hope of it coming back is doubtable. And two, Vietnamese Francophone is a culturally specific phenomenon that requires the proper conditions in order to be categorically viable or to survive into the future, which makes it fairly difficult when we don't really have very many speakers in Vietnam. However, for the moment, the question that arises is what one is to make of a field when the moment of its constitution coincides with the disappearance of the object of study. By this, I do not mean that the works produced are gone, since they will always exist in some form, but what is it that this existence entails, which raises concerns? But differently, what will be a Vietnamese Francophone if there are no significant Vietnamese audience to read it? Or what happens to a literary corpus when it ceases to be a living archive? For Jaeger, the answer is quite clear, in that the decline of the literature no way reduces the literature's validity or seemingly urgent relevancy. Indeed, as Jaeger affirms, being grounded in a historical moment or a specific culture does not lessen the novel's value, which is to say, we might as well study it for what it is rather than ignore it as something of the past. So regardless of what one feels about that statement, and whether or not one is against or for this form of valorization of literature, no position could be taken which does not acknowledge how some notion of futurity is already preconfigured within this framing of the literature, even in its twilight. Indeed, temporality, and here futurity in particular, is a crucial element that must be addressed. It is curious then that many of the interventions since Jaeger's text have skirted around this temporal element and have taken more general trends of post-colonial literature, namely with cultural hybridity, national allegories, or even colonial nostalgia as the main critical modes. My question here is whether these critical modes are most appropriate, since they don't tend to generate much more conversations about the work, at least nothing super invigorating. So admittedly, while the more general post-colonial modes of readings have certainly proven to be productive in their explanations and categorizations of some of these novels, especially since hybridity and allegories are pertinent issues in post-colonial literature, more broadly speaking, I insist, however, that there is a danger that such categorizations could detract from the possibility of reading some of these texts in their singularity. That is to say, in an effort to canonize Vietnamese Francophone in North America and to make it appeal to a broader discussion, if in the post-colonial condition, scholars have employed modes of readings and attached certain labels which may not have adequately addressed the specificity of this literature and the conditions of its production and circulation. So all that to say that my goal then is to suggest a different orientation in regards to some of the key texts of Vietnamese Francophone. And I do so with the conviction that until now, most of the works under the category of Vietnamese literature has been read as something of the past, or as a literature that is always backwards looking in very much the same way that it was inaugurated. And it's constantly stuck in its own nostalgia. That's sort of like the other tag to it. On its own, this isn't entirely problematic, since it does help us read and enter some of these works. However, when most of the criticism points towards this reminiscing of a closed past, it can be difficult to imagine an alternate reading and consequently spark discussions about these works, which is essentially what I want to do. What I offer then is a reading that draws on a vision of the future and of futurity located in the past in the three novels from three separate writers. And here they are. Two of them, Pham Duy Khim and Kim Lefèvre, are traditionally considered Vietnamese Francophone writers, as they're ethnically Vietnamese, with Lefèvre being a Métis. While the other one, Marguerite Duras, is a French colonial writer, which we can discuss later as to why I included her. So through a reading of Duras's Un barrage, Contre le Pacifique, Duy Khim's Nam et Sylvie, and Kim Lefèvre's Retour à la Saison de Pluie, my main argument is that through the trope of a failed romantic union, the impossible return of the origins, and a desire for a historical transmission, it is possible to locate the main thrust of these novels as a type of qualm towards a yet-to-come future, rather than as a longing for a post-colonial, for a colonial past, which tended to have been the perspective prior. So published in 1957, Nam Kim's Nam et Sylvie is a poetic narrative that recounts an intimate relationship between two lovers whose name makes up the novel's title. Nam, an Indo-Chinese student who came to Paris to study at the École Normale in the 1930s, where he met his French lover Sylvie at a dance held at the Maison d'étudiants de l'Indochine. That's where they just kept all the colonial students. Told retrospectively from Nam's point of view, the novel unfolds in a series of letters exchanged between the two characters. Given Nam's precarious status as a foreign student and the complications brought about by their interracial relationship during the height of the colony, Sylvie ends up getting an abortion. Then the couple eventually splits up and Nam returns to Vietnam. On the surface, Kim's novel is fairly typical and it doesn't stray too far from its predecessors of the same genre. It is a heterosexual colonial relationship that ends fairly poorly because of external factors which neither of the lovers have any control over. Yet where it stands out is the way it explores post-colonial temporality with the same familiar tropes of a failed romantic union. According to Carl Ashoka Brito, what complicates the novel are precisely the temporal disjuncture wherein the events of the past are interlaced with those of the present. So in a sense, so here he writes, in a sense, Nam and Sylvie straddles the colonial post-colonial divide. Its complex structure evokes a double temporal framing. On the one hand, that of the colonial period, embodied in the letters and journal entries written in the 1930s. On the other, that of Nam's retrospective narrative, filtered through the backward gaze of post-colonial remembrance. So again, there's always this talk of like going back to the past and remembering as if that were the main thing. Because of this double framing where the narrator now must reconcile with his feelings towards the past, the novel seems to project all the causal elements of the story into this abstract bygone time, where the present only serves as a locus of enunciation, explicating what has preceded the current day. Nam, who was an Indo-Chinese student at the time, now writes as a citizen of a post-colonial Vietnam, but seems to hold very tightly to these memories. This is clear from the very first line of the novel, where the reader is presented with a brief but concise end to the couple's relationship, and Nam's last hours in France, which reads this. I'm just going to read the French. Il y a plus de 20 ans, au moment où mes études achevaient, je m'apprêtais à quitter Paris à la France. J'ai voulu revoir Sylvie, avec qui j'avais rompu depuis plusieurs mois. Right? So, sorry. Where am I? And so it's at the beginning of the novel that we see the relationship ending. So this is just how it opens up, right? It's as if to suggest that what has transpired between the two is now concretized into some inaccessible time, and that the opening serves as an invitation to explore this past. For this reason, it's not hard to imagine why Brito would analyze the novel through the framework of nostalgia. Or why others, such as André Lebois, the professor who presented Kim with an honorary doctorate at the University of Toulouse, would have done the same in 1957. Yet this departure, that will be the hallmark of their amorous relationship and what gets brought up as the moment in which a subject recognizes itself as living within a disjunctive time, ever caught in what they believe to be between the before and after of the event. The departure is addressed further when leaving Paris. Okay, so here Nam says, aucun homme ne peut sans une certaine mélancolie s'éloigner pour toujours peut-être d'un lieu où il y a beaucoup vécu, qu'il s'agisse non d'un pays comme la France, d'une ville comme Paris, et si par la même occasion, on se prépare de ses années d'étudiant et de sa jeunesse. Et ce n'est pas une tristesse vague qui se ressent, mais un déchirement secret. So what makes this departure difficult, aside from the solidifying the breakup itself, is that it also coincides with a very particular time in the life of Nam. The déchirement secret, as Nam points out to, is an amidst loss that is more than the relationship. It is to his jeunesse. It is to his Paris. It is a certain era that seems to have been left behind with this departure. As with many other novels whose timeline is caught between the before and after of the colonial independence, whatever personal narratives recounted always seems to be told in a conjunction of the very real ruptures of the colonial empire, as though it were another foundational fiction. Plainly put, it is very difficult to read this novel without seeing the drama as representative of an allegorical relationship between the two countries. or the failure of a happy union between Nam and Sylvie as the failure of a union between France and Vietnam. Certainly, if one does look at Nam and Sylvie's relationship through the lens of a national allegory, then it would seem quite necessary that this relationship ended, since it meant the possibility of full autonomy for Nam, also Vietnam. That in this sense, the departure was his time to establish himself as a new man. With such a reading, however, the departure might signal another kind of sadness, one in which the colonial relationship is seen as something romantic in retrospect, a type of colonial nostalgia that sees the imperial project as a failed attempt of the impossible. It also means that what's more important than the relationship is, in fact, the affirmation of a national consciousness as though it were the goal all along. It reproduces a type of nationalist teleology that I don't think exists here. The problem with such a reading is that it does precisely that. It reproduces and presupposes a teleology to the end of a relationship as though it could have been predicted. But the development of an independent nation state as the natural process of historical development following colonialism is not necessarily true. It doesn't have to be that way. This is where it's important to read Kim's novel not exclusively as a national allegory, and instead as a proper love story, full of unpredictability. This must be emphasized because colonialism in French Indochina was extremely chaotic, and there was indeed no divine reason as to why it occurred as it did. To read the novel exclusively along the lines of historical development traps it within this orientation that guarantees meaning, and at least in historical sense. The departure thus is perplexing since there is no apparent transcendental meaning beyond itself, and Nam still has yet to resolve what it meant for him. Yet it calls attention to itself as a sort of fundamental rupture that persists throughout the narration. It causes Nam to dwell between what has transpired in the colony and what it takes to move forward. In the same passage as earlier, where he thinks back to his departure from France and the difficulties of such a separation, particularly since he must return to his native land, Nam says, ajouté pour l'anamite, on dit Vietnamien maintenant, qui avait le courage de retourner vers les siens de ce temps-là, en lourde appréhension, presque hongroise, qu'il faut être né indigène des colonies pour comprendre. There are several points to be made here. Firstly, even to refer to himself as l'anamite, Nam must remind himself that such an identity has now been substituted for the new vocabulary Vietnamien after independence. Secondly, that a departure does not always signal a smooth return, that the life he had in France no longer allows him to simply reintegrate into the then colony without much anguish. A few lines later, he refocuses on Sylvie in saying this. Mais ce fut la pensée de Sylvie, l'idée que j'allais définitivement la perdre, son absence à la gare enfin, qui achève de rendre ce départ atroce pour moi, au point que je deviens incapable de composer un visage décent. Once again, the physical departure cannot be disassociated from the amorous relationship, and the colonial love is reintroduced as a point of ambivalence for Nam. Leaving does not mean he will be cut free from the past, nor the thoughts of Sylvie, which continue to affect him. As Brito affirms, if the novel can be read as a nostalgic text, the sources around which the retrospective narrative built its nostalgia turns out to be already constructed themselves. In a sense, there is no moment of originary fullness to be lost. Consequently, if there is no true, and so back to me, consequently, if there is truly no fullness to which one can return, then the choice to ponder over this rupture must indeed serve some other purpose than restoring the past. That is to say that one does not simply dwell in the past for the past itself, to recreate its conditions as to experience it once more, right? He's not trying to be in love with Sylvie again, but that perhaps this dwelling is prompted by the sense of loss that is ever present, an obstacle that must be reconciled and superseded in order to think of the future. And if we want to take this in terms of national allegory, then a sort of like decolonizing politics have to be in place where you have to get rid of one type of society in order to have a different one, right? As Nam insists later in the novel, rien n'est jamais tout à fait fini dans le monde du cœur, right? The rupture is impactful because it produces a subject that must live with a double consciousness of a before and after, where personal identity is marked by the presence and absence of a colonial regime, which, akin to an old flame, never truly disappears as one moves forward. So whatever the future holds or whatever future is perceivable must take this rupture as the starting point. So to me, the couple's aborted child, which I spoke about earlier, does signal the death of one future, but because of it, both characters are afforded a different future. Because remember, in the colonial period, they would have both gone to jail. And so in addition to a nostalgic reminiscing, I also take this novel as an example of a post-colonial anxiety about national liberation, where moving forward doesn't have to mean an unambiguous march in the direction of happiness. The novel is pretty tragic, but it always accompanied by memories of an ambivalent past and the difficulty in producing a history of that past in moving towards the future. Okay, so this colonial love story with its before and after is also, for me, the hallmark of Duras's Un barrage contre le Pacifique. Set in French Indochina, Duras's novel tells the story of a French family who finds themselves at the whims of the colonial government and the elements. After the death of her father, the mother, who is referred to simply as la mère, and there's a double play here because la mère is the mother, but then la mer is also the ocean, which tries to take their land. Sorry, what was I? Tries against all odds to raise her children in a parcel of land that refuses to be tamed. The seawall, to which the title of the novel refers, is an attempt by the mother to build physical infrastructure against the rising seawater, against the warnings of the locals. Of course, as it goes, these efforts result in the loss of much resources, and the sea comes again and again to reclaim the land. Much of the drama revolves around the trials and tribulations of the mother, who, without much resources or luck, tries to raise two children on her own while debtors on her back. The two siblings, Joseph and Suzanne, are raised alongside native children and have a very idyllic life in the countryside by the city of Ram, which is sort of fictitious, based on another city in Cambodia. One of the main characters, Monsieur Joe, who is the son of a rich plantation owner in the colony, tries to pursue the younger sister without much success, while Joseph, the angry older son, acts out of contempt of their situation against his sister's suitor. As the novel goes on, the family's luck does not turn around. The colonial dream ends when the mother eventually dies. Right before the mother's death, Suzanne loses her virginity to the plantation neighbor's son, Jean-Auguste, with whom she has no intention of marrying, and who also has no intention of marrying her. Joseph, perhaps the character that demonstrated the most ardent resentment towards the colonial administration, leaves the family's guns with the locals as a way to take out revenge against those who brought about his family's misfortune, mainly the colonial government. The novel ends with both siblings, along with Auguste, loading the mother's coffin and leaving the property to never return. Okay, so while there are many possible readings of this novel, ranging from ecological to racial critiques, which I think might be interesting for further research, I think it's also equally interesting to read it as a romantic misencounter. Like Kim's novel, Duras's novel also paints a portrait of a people who seem to have fate against their side. Of the several key characters described, none of them truly are happy with their personal situation, nor that of the colony, as sadness and poverty seems to be a reoccurring theme. Yet at its core, love seems to be the main concern, or more to the Durasian style, a love that is composed of a mixture of sensual experience of lustful youth and the anguish of unfulfilled desires. Indeed, these unfulfilled desires seep into all aspects of the characters' lives in various ways. For the mother, it is the disappointment that her dreams of wealth and happiness were never fully achieved. Not only did her husband die, but the property she purchased never managed to turn a profit as she planned. For Joseph, who spent much of the novel hunting and running off, it is about never getting the figurative bounty of the hunt of the colonial dream. As for Suzanne, her desires are like many women in the colony in the sense that for much of the novel, she always played the role of an appeasement for both the mother and Joseph. Her desires were never really her own, but rather imprints of those around her. As Kevin O'Neill points out, much of what Suzanne does is against her nature, in the sense that she always places Joseph before herself and thus effectively lives in his shadow. In all these cases, however, it would appear that much of the resentment the family harbor stems from the departure of their reality with their expectations. Yet the novel operates on a multitude of departures that cannot be singularly attributed to any one instance, since one might also say that the death of the father or the move from France were also forms of departure that do not signal any possible return. In this way, unlike Nam and Sylvie, which marks departure as the moment Nam leaves France and which produces a before and after of the narrative, Duras's novel takes a departure as the constant of colonial life. Even at the end of the novel, it is quite possible to read the mother's death and the parting of the siblings as both a departure and a new beginning. As Claire Lindenbaum reminds us in her work on spatiality and embarrage, the novel was indeed a way of addressing her past. So here she says, en effet, l'écriture immémoriale de Duras transforme la négativité du souvenir en réintégrant dans une image inversée de la libération. Ainsi, elle ne peut raconter l'histoire de son frère qu'en accordant au Joseph du roman le courage d'affranchir sa sœur Suzanne du rêve colonial de leur mère. Un barrage retrace donc la douleur de Duras tout en transformant en libération de Joseph. En face de la destruction et de la folie subie, Duras reconstruit sa mémoire ensanglantée à partir de sa terre nourricière. In such a way, Duras's novel manages to take the past as a material to move forward, to transform the negativity into a form of liberation, and in a way departs from the trajectory that is otherwise engulfed in sadness. Like the character Suzanne, Duras's own life begins when she leaves Indochina and returns to France. Indeed, this departure, if we take it to mean a constant deviation of what would have been, what should have been, makes a lot of sense when it comes to explaining the mother's desperation. For the mother, all the anxiety of managing the property finds itself realized in the seemingly hopelessness of every day that culminates in an overbearing depression, which contributed to her failing health that eventually led to her death at the end of the novel. Yet when she's asked about what is attributing to her lack of desire to live, what she cites is actually her son Joseph incapable of writing letters properly, right? In the final scene, when Auguste visited the mother and Suzanne after the two had just had sex on the family's pineapple farm, she tells him, mais il fait tellement de fautes d'orthographe que ça me rend malade, right? Given her occupation as the French teacher in the colony, one might read such a passage with a light or a sense of dark humor. However, another reading of these lines might be that Joseph's incapacity to write signals the failure of the family to inscribe themselves properly into the history of the colony. What's important about the letter is that if one takes grammar and orthography as the prescribed notion of language in theory, where there's a formula and a rationale for right and wrong, and an opportunity to inscribe something permanent, Joseph's improper writing and a lack of attention is the actualization of how dreams or prescriptive grammar clashes with reality, the actual uses of language. Here, through the example of improper orthography, departure takes on a different meaning, their lives. Like Joseph's written letters, exemplifies and concretizes a departure of what should have been with what is. To further this notion of departure as deviation, we can also say that it engenders a different trajectory than what the characters have imagined for themselves and their situation. Like Kim's novel, departure here does not signal a clear break from the past. Instead, it triggers a different understanding of the self, wherein what comes prior is not separate from the present or future, but rather what comes prior always carries over. The father's death, for example, is both the rupture of a possible future and the foundational moment that irreversibly affects how the family carries out its affairs, right? They're sort of cursed in the shadow of his death. Indeed, it is a departure that persists with the family as it forces characters like Joseph to take the position of the head male of the family, a position which he resents. As a result, he enacts this departure periodically by leaving the family and disappearing ever so often as though to avoid any true attachment. Perhaps it can be said then that the departure in Un Barrage is a recurring theme which severs the characters from their past and what allows them to move towards the future. The death of the mother at the end of the novel is also a moment of liberation for Suzanne and her brother. Okay, so finally, this constant departure and persistence of the past into the present is also a core aspect of the final novel that I'm going to talk about, and it's Kim Lefèvre's Retour à la saison de pluie. Written as an autobiographical text, this novel, and I say novel in quotes because it's autobiographical, but I'm sure there's things that have been done up, is often read as Lefèvre's sequel to her work, Métisse Blanche, where she delves into her own childhood memories as a Eurasian child born in colonial Vietnam. Naturally, the question of identity that was pervasive throughout the first book is also apparent in Retour, which details her personal attachments to Vietnam and her desire to return. Yet, as she finds, the Vietnam to which she returns is not the one she left, and eventually recognizes the impossibility of such return. And this is sort of like a reoccurring trope in a lot of post-colonial novels. You leave the home country and then you realize, oh wait, no, I can't go back to that because that thing doesn't exist. It was all of, a sort of narrative I produced for myself. The book is broken up into two sections. The first, Le Passé Ressurgi, outlining her personal history and the reasons for her desire to return, while the second, titled Le Retour, recounts her physical return to the country where she encounters her relatives, but most importantly, her mom. Like the other two examples, Retour does not take the past as that which is out of reach or inaccessible from the present, but as something that is concurrent with the present. As demonstrated in the title of the first section with Le Passé Ressurgi, the past resurfaces as to remind the narrator of the slippages and porousness of the past and the present. Like elsewhere in the text, the title of the work, Retour, already indicates a notion of departure and return as part of the same narration. Lefèvre opens the book by announcing her return in saying this: Les dés sont jetés, j'ai enfin pris la décision de retourner au Vietnam après tant ans d'absence. And with this opening, she points to return as something that has been long due, and that finally, the enfin, the rupture that occurred in the decisive moment 30 years ago would be amended. The text opens thus as an attempt to bridge a timeline between past and present. As in the other two novels, temporality is central to how the narrator understands herself in the world. As she writes, 30 ans, c'est une mesure de quantité, mais pour moi, c'est une plage qui s'entend entre mes 20 ans et aujourd'hui. C'est une vie, ma vie. Right? A little melodramatic, right? For Lefèvre, the time between when she departed Vietnam to now isn't just a number. Surely it can be parceled out and counted, but the image of that beach that spans and connects her former, younger self with the present offers readers the notion of something else, an entire life, her life. It is an image that incites notions of continuity and reverberation of a figure of a beach that is often used as both the site of departure and return for voyages, which, you know, between Vietnam and France, there was really no way of getting other than by ship and much later with planes, but that was much more during the American period. Okay. As in Duras and Khim's text, departure here is not a definitive cutoff. Instead, it is remembered by the waves that come ever so often, which reminds us of the other side of the ocean, there is another shore. As such, what appears to be a cutoff is also something that reconnects the present to the past. For different feeling, despite feeling detached from who she was, Lefèvre is still herself. This image of moving water is furthered when Lefèvre speaks for how this past affects the way she sees her current reality. In the following section, she writes, Mais n'est ailleurs que le sol vietnamien flottant à demi de l'endroit où j'ai pris ma source, comme un long fleuve dont l'amont serait si éloigné qu'il me paraît à présent enveloppe de brume. Et lorsque ma mémoire s'y reporte, il m'arrive de douter de sa réalité. Here, despite being enveloped in a mist that makes her doubt what truly is, she nonetheless sees the past as a source that brings a source of her being, and that ultimately a connection that still exists. For Jaeger, these liquid metaphors all points to a place of origins as a word for the Vietnamese in Vietnamese, which we have here. Đất nước, literally translated as country, is the words land and water. Right? It is, as he puts, a move to integrate herself into the history of Vietnam, from which she has been excluded for her mixed heritage. However, aside from the desire to enact some primordial connection to the source, it is also worth noting that the figure of the river carries much more symbolic weight within the Vietnamese cultural milieu. The expression to cross the river or to sang song generally implies a completed act that cannot be reversed, such as taking someone's hand in marriage. So em sang song, em đã sang song is like a thing that is repeated and people cry because, oh no, she married the wrong guy. Anyways. Within the Vietnamese popular culture, there are innumerable references to one lover crossing the river while the other leaving the other lover behind. These two banks of the river, although not impossible to traverse, represents an obstacle that should make the subject in the subject question their path, such as the poor romantic decision or missed opportunity. It is rather interesting then that Lefèvre would open her text being introduced with introducing this image of the river, which is at once a source as well as a reminder of the initial departure that makes her question her past. It is in this regard, Jaeger has commented on the text, this, and I'm almost done. If Métis Blanche, her first book, seemed to hold the past at some distance, albeit temporal, in Retour, Kim Lefèvre tries to excavate this same past and examines it carefully. In doing so, she immerses herself, returning physically to the site of childhood as an essential act in this exploration. But like the literary genre she had chosen to record it, Her personal history is not easy to limit and define. The work of memory and dream has transformed her story. Fog and haze mask the past, making it difficult to remember with clarity a life lived so long ago. Indeed, at its core, this text holds the past as a form of living archive, while simultaneously doubting whether memory, the tools by which one excavates said past, memory proves unreliable. This is important since the past, insofar as memory is concerned, is never concrete, and much less so when the stakes are that of personal subjectivity. So unlike Nam and Sylvie, where the main plot is about a failed romance, or Barrage, where the romance is turned on its head as something treacherous, Retour is a poetic aftermath of that forbidden colonial romance. As a mixed child of a French father and a Vietnamese mother, Lefèvre is masked by a prior romance that she herself must work out in order for a new future to arise. It is through this working out of the identity, reuniting with her Vietnamese family, interacting with and learning about their relationships, that this emphasis on romance becomes part of the narration. In this way, readers are left with a text that begins not only with a budding romance, not with a budding romance, but from a similar point of departure of the other two novels. In reconciling with the colonial romance as an originary rupture, she ends her book in this way. Un dicton vietnamien dit, la vie est comme un miroir. Il vous revoit votre image quand vous êtes en proche. S'il vous oublie quand vous êtes loin, ainsi du miroir de ma vie passée, il me restitue quelques reflets tandis que je suis présente. Mais lorsque je quitterai ce pays, mon image s'effacera et je ne resterai plus de traces dans ce paysage d'eau où il recommence à pleuvoir. Thus, like the other two novels, Lefèvre's work concludes by signaling another departure. And like the other two works, this defined departure from the country of her birth, which has haunted her over the years, is what has allowed her to move on with her life. Okay, so in conclusion, and I have really had to redact this from like over 70 pages, what I wanted to show in these readings of these novels is that while a nostalgic mode might be deployed for the narration, it is not the only way that one could read these works. Additionally, like the post-colonial world, the ruptures between past and present in these works are never quite clear. The departure from one possible outcome always leads to another, and that the past is in some ways always embedded within the present, perhaps holding the key to imagining a different future. All three of these main characters have to sort of like work through this in order to sort of reimagine themselves differently. Enacting this by its mere existence, Vietnamese Francophone is undoubtedly a remnant of a colonial past. But as one encounters, especially in the works I've mentioned, there is no future unless the past in question is questioned head on. So on that premise, Vietnamese Francophone isn't some strand of literary Francophilia or bourgeois fetish that's stuck in the past, but very much an integral part of the history of the country's robust and dispersed literature, trying to think about moving forward into the future. So here, futurism might not be the aesthetic form, but it's certainly configured within the works that I have shown. Thank you. So I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much for your presentation. As we would like to encourage, please raise your hand, or if you want to put it in the chat if you have a question. I guess as people kind of trickle in with their questions or have them looking through their head, I was curious if, do you think often, you know, they refer to as the colonial relationship between French and Vietnam as kind of like this romance or a failed romance or a treacherous romance? Is this, do you find that what the authors actually viewed the colonial relationship, or is it more of a euphemism that they purposely use to make it, I guess, more savory for its readers?
I definitely think the latter. It's always more sexy to talk about failed romances, right? We love breakup stories. I don't think these books are free from that. And I think they use that a lot. And it really leads into a reading that's premised on the type of national allegory that we've seen. At the same time, I think it's only useful to a certain extent, and we rely on it too much. We sort of then get stuck, and we can't seem to have any other type of conversation about these novels, which I think is entirely possible. There is a little bit of like gymnastics you sort of have to do, but at the same time, I think there's a lot of works where we do that already, and so I don't find it much of a stretch to do it here.
Michael, I see that your hand is raised.
Hey, thank you. First of all, thanks so much for a really good talk, Vin. It's good to see you, and it's good to hear how your work is going. It was really interesting. I'm curious about whether Proust plays a role for any of these authors, especially for Kim Lefèvre. Just the idea of, or there seems to be a potentially conscious reworking of this framework of trying to find a past that's no longer there and see what imprints it's left on you and in what ways it still lives in the present and into the future. Do you think that any of the authors that you're working with here are engaging in something approximating a post-colonial rewriting of Proust?
I certainly don't doubt that. That's definitely part of their education, along with several other writers that were prominent in the 20th century, I think, in France. And Proust was definitely one of those people that they were really shoving in the colonial education system. That said, I think it's just also a very common trope in post-colonial writing to sort of like do the return, right? Like the Carrier, for example, somebody help me, the Carrier, to like the Retour au Pays Natal. That's the other famous book. And it's always sort of like this return, this return, this return. And sort of like I guess, the spark for them is that, wait a minute, this is like, what am I returning to? Like all of it was a fiction, right? So in a way, they're sort of addressing it by reproducing, like by producing other fictions and inadvertently reproducing the type of fictions that have come before them, right? The return was never possible, but the desire is always sort of there. And so they're working through it by just sort of writing about a return that they can't do.
Thank you.
In more modern literary works, I don't know if this is your area of study, but is this idea of return also often repeated into the future, or is this kind of situated within the literary works that you're just looking at?
I think for a lot of writers, the idea of like an actual physical return is not very desirable. I think that moment sort of has passed in post-colonial writing, but I think in a lot of post-colonial writings in general, after independence, a lot of people don't have a desire to return. And I think that just has to do with how a lot of these countries sort of developed after independence, right? With at least with the colony, and I hope I'm not saying anything too crazy with this, at least in the colony, you know your role. Whereas in a lot of post-colonial governments, you're not really sure because of like the sort of like conditions that the country is in, but then also that what you know and what you want to return to is really no longer existent. So I would say there are authors today living in France who actually have no desire to return, or who were lucky enough and they have different types of citizenships to where returning is like more of a leisure thing than it is a necessity for them. But you know, like today, it's much more removed than the situation I would say about half a century ago. But I do think that in terms of content, even the ones who are residing in France and who have no desire to actually live in Vietnam still write about Vietnam. Even if I'm thinking of mainly of Linda Lay, who sort of like rejects this Vietnamese identity, she still writes about Vietnam all the time. So if they don't return physically, or they're not writing about or expressing a desire to be there, their content is in a way also proving some type of like incapacity to move on the idea of returning. So that's what I see.
Anna, I believe that you have a question.
I do. I don't know why co-hosts don't have the function of raised hands. So every time when I have a question, I need to ask Cara to invite me to speak. Vin, I'm working with French colonialism and comparison of urban development between North Africa and actually Laos for one of my papers. And I know that when we talk about French colonialism, it actually has very different forms if you look at Algeria or Vietnam or Laos. And so that also kind of translates in different production of cinematic narratives. And so I'm not sure if that is something you were interested in, but when you start talking about the Francophone post-coloniality, is a narrative produced by the Vietnamese writers are in any way different or similar to other Francophone post-colonialities or temporalities?
I just want to say thanks, Huang. I'm going to read that. I haven't gotten a chance to take a look at it, but I'll look at that link. And for Anna, I think So I go more into depth with the differences between like Algeria and Senegal, for example, with what happens in French Indochina. As you know, Algeria, for example, has a very substantial number of French speakers. In relation to what Vietnam currently has, was like less than 1%. Algeria, I think in the realm of a couple million, I think, and at its height, it was considered part of France in very much a different way than Vietnam was considered part of France, right? And sort of in terms of how it was occupied, and also just in terms of sheer distance, right? To get to Vietnam, it was a journey. To get to Cambodia, it was definitely a journey. But that wasn't the case with Algeria, and it certainly wasn't also the case when they imported workers. So I think the relationship between France and Algeria produced a very much different context for how post-colonial writings work. The difficulty I have in this dissertation is trying to sort of map out where certain things reoccur, right? So it makes sense when we talk about Senegal, or the Congo, or other places in French-speaking Africa, or even in Quebec, where there are Vietnamese writers in Quebec who work in French. It's a no-brainer. It's not really a question. Like, that is just the language, right? That is one of the major languages. It's one of the historical languages. In Vietnam, it's a historical language, but it's not a spoken language, right? And at the same time, my thing is, if we're not talking about it there, then we can only talk about it in the US, because Vietnamese people aren't going to learn French to pick up a bunch of to pick up some novels that don't seem relevant to their current condition. So the ecosystem is entirely different. Whereas I think in Algeria, for example, you could very well possible have like a congress where you could sort of have French speakers come talk about the literary production as it's happening. Whereas I think in the situation in Vietnam, it's not that it's extinct or non-existent, but that it exists in a very small number. And sort of its height was in the 90s, but even by the 90s, the majority of Vietnamese speakers have either left to go to France or Canada or whatever else. And so there seems to be this thing that's sort of like there, or sort of like a shell of a thing, or sort of like I guess a relic, but it's also sort of a relic that's kind of alive, half alive, somewhat alive, right? And I think that's what's really interesting to me, because it's not so intuitive as what you would find in Africa. Yeah. And also I think in Cambodia as well, because actually Embarrage, they did make it into a film, right? And that I think he's Cambodian, right? The director of the film. I'm not sure. Has anybody here read any of these books?
Well, I guess someone did answer that Ritipan was the director of Embarrage, so it is of Cambodian ancestry. I personally haven't read them. My French isn't good enough to pore over these novels.
There are some translations, I would say, especially with Duras and Lefèvre. They're much more read. With the Pham Duy Khim, for example, he wrote that like after, I think after independence, and so it was a very like precarious situation. And also, he was the former ambassador to France of South Vietnam, so it's a very strange thing to sort of be reading him. So I imagine there's reasons for why he wouldn't be necessarily popular, or why he's not being translated now. But it is a good novel. If you enjoy sort of like these sad, languishing novels about failed relationships. Yes, so in contemporary Vietnam, it's not much of a question. As far as I know, a lot of Vietnamese families, at least some of the people I've spoken to, there's this sort of general perspective that you learn English to make money and you learn French to get culture. So there's a type of hierarchy there that seems a little bit pompous, right? But I don't think that it's sorry, let me try to rephrase how I'm thinking about this. But it's very much there, I would say that. I think just the difference is that the people who tend to move to France have much more of an attachment to France, whereas I think people who move to the US, it's like probably just because the US is the US. And it's not for any like major historical reasons. It's more so because either they have family there or it's better opportunities in terms of education. And it's just very accessible. And English is very popular in Vietnam, as it is in the Philippines. And I think that has a lot to do with it. So the hierarchy isn't like so strict to say that like, oh yeah, the more cultured or people do this and the less cultured people do that. It's more of a less of the sort of like remaining perspective we still have that I think is partly due to the fact that French has such a long lasting presence in the country that like today, for example, if you go to like temples, there are like older temples, at least some of the ones I've seen in Saigon, there's still plaques and the information is either written, it's in Vietnamese or it's in French, right? Like the ones that are like really pretty metal plaques. And then if you go to some of the newer things that are being built, then you'll definitely see it in English or sometimes Russian, depending on which part of the country you're in. But I still think that on a cultural level, there is still some like reverence to French, even though young people tend to sort of like ignore it because English just appears cooler and a lot of cultural materials are now available and accessible in English. And plus tourists speak English, yeah.
Anna, you have another question?
Well, since you pronounced Russian, I was wondering if you can also trace any legacies of Russian or Soviet literature in Vietnam. And I think my question is exactly, is it Russian or Soviet, if there is any?
That would be out of my area of expertise. There is quite a bit of people, language is escaping me. There are quite a few people who do speak Russian in Vietnam for obvious reasons and for historical reasons. I'm unaware of whether or not they've produced a sort of comparable body of literature as the one we see with French, precisely for the reason that I think a lot of people learned Russian to be functionaries and to be diplomats. Whereas I think with French, it was very top down, and a lot of rich families at the time also did it by choice. Like they just sent their kids to Paris. That wasn't really a question. So I am unsure, but there could be. It would be interesting for sure. I do know that in Hanoi, there's like groups of like Russian speakers, that old Vietnamese Russian speakers that still meet up and like have beers, and I don't know, they talk in Russian. That's, but I don't know if they produce anything.
Tina Crit has a question. I'm curious to hear a bit more about how this is related to the other set of your literary archives in the Philippines, and what is your comparative take on these two sets of literary works? Okay, so this is originally started out as like, I wanted to actually do also Cuba and Guinea Equatorial. That's not going to happen. I think it's just a lot of work. But in terms of like other archives like the Philippines, it has a very similar trajectory, right? Except the colonization period lasted much longer. You have like 3-4 centuries of Spanish presence. And at the same time, by the time you get to the 80s and to today, there aren't many Spanish speakers in the Philippines. There are some, but I would say it's fairly negligible if you're going to still think about it in comparison to like a Latin American country, right? And there are reasons for this, of course. The linguistic situation in the Philippines is very complicated. There's a bunch of different languages. Transportation between the different islands are not so simple. And also Spanish was never widely taught, right? I think they learned fairly early on in Latin America in the colonial experience that if you teach natives the language and they can speak back, you better be prepared for what they have to say. So in order to just avoid that and to make evangelization much easier, you just learn their language and you translate the Bible into their language, and then you just keep it at that. So there are a lot of lines of similarities here too, right? So because of that, you have a very small population, an elite population that speaks it,
And then towards the beginning of the 20th century, you also have the American presence, right? So this also adds on another layer that sort of deters people from one, learning the language, because this is not going to make you money in the same way as it did when it was a colony. And also because of in the development of the 20th century, English just became the language you had to speak to basically function. But that said, people were still writing and up into the 70s in Spanish. There's a book that's called Literatura Hispano-Filipina Actual, which like deals with all the contemporary writers in the Philippines. They do a lot of poetry, short stories, sometimes short plays. It's not as substantial, but at the same time, it's not absent either. And I think that's something that we sort of have to contend with, because otherwise the trajectory is always going to be, and especially the way that I see, I don't know if I'm speaking out of line here, but with like new hires, with Francophone departments that are trying to like cater to this emergent world, right? That's sort of like late, is trying to go towards Africa, right? It's like, this is the new thing. There are other forms of alterity that exist out there in the language that we have to sort of reconcile with. And in the same way, this shift towards like, oh, we got to emphasize Latin America in Hispanic studies or Spanish literature departments. They do so, but then again, there's still this part of the Philippines where we sort of like neglect it. And I can say this fairly confidently, because I've spoken with people who've worked on the Philippines, and the general consensus is that like, it's not that you can't work on the Philippines in in Spanish departments, but it's just going to be super niche. And unless you're at the, I don't know, 4 or 5 institutions where that's going to be really supported, you're going to have a hard time trying to both access the material and also find people who have any sort of expertise on it. And I think Adam Leafshe, who wrote a book on who wrote several articles on this, for him, the amount of programs we have in the country that teach Spanish in relation to the amount of those programs that mention the Philippines as part of the colony and as sort of like as part of that living literary ecosystem is very few. And so that's sort of like where I'm drawing the lines of comparison between Vietnam and the Philippines. It's that they both have to deal with these processes of colonialism, then all the different years of American occupation, and then also have a literary corpus in a colonial language that is there. The population doesn't read it, and then the burden then goes onto North American academia to sort of address something, right? And when we do that, we produce like a very strange time frame for when something is produced and versus when something is received. So like one of the novels, for example, from the Philippines was, I think, was written in the 50s. And it wasn't really published until like the 90s, I think. Yeah, and then I think the last version that's accessible wasn't made until the early 2000s, and it actually was only sold to be archived, and it was never even sold to be read. Yeah, I hope that answered it. I just want to thank everybody for coming. It is a very niche topic. I recognize that, but I do think there's some relevancy in thinking about the framing of post-coloniality in general, because post-colonial literature isn't like a monolithic thing, right? Each colonialism is sort of like different, even from one empire to like with its different colonies. So I think it's worthy to think about like sort of Vietnam as a case study in which a literature is existent, but its treatment is fairly different from other former colonies, right? And so I've cited like Algeria, but you can also think of like Morocco, for example, where there's a lot of stuff being produced, and that gets a much different treatment. And despite being like sort of part of the Association for like the Francophone Association with France, Vietnam is by far one of like the countries where French is spoken the least. And so I think it's very interesting that we have this dynamic. But as a final word, I would like to thank everybody for coming and for joining me in this conversation. Your questions helped a lot.
Yes, and thank you so much for your presentation. It really was enjoyable. Even if it was a niche topic, I'm sure we all learned something incredibly interesting about, you know, the dynamics between a Francophone country that doesn't really speak French anymore, but nevertheless produces a very rich and interesting body of literature. with that, if there's no other lingering questions, thank you all for joining the last Gatty series. And I'll probably reiterate that it's been a pleasure being your graduate co-chairs. And I hope you all have a wonderful summer.